Hey, good afternoon, scholars. I hope your morning's been going well. I hope you had a good Mother's Day. I hope you made whichever mothers you were celebrating. I hope you made them feel extra special. Um, let's check out our turn-in rates. They dipped a little bit. I'm wondering if Mother's Day didn't have something to do with it. But this is our second day in a row we have dips, so I'm hoping we can bring it back up with today's assignment. Let's take a look at our grit list. I always love to see. Actually, I love seeing highlighted names and non-highlighted names equally. Highlighted names means somebody stepped up, and non-highlighted means show consistency that you've been on the list. So I'm glad to see Caleb, Edwin, Joaquin, Lisbeth, Tamar, and Uriel back up. Um, Tomorrow I'm going to go over one of your answers because you did some of the better, some really good work. And also, I'm glad to see Aldair, Chris A, Angel H, Anthony, Catherine, Diana, Esmer, Jacqueline, Jeshua, Molly, Nevea. Glad to see you guys sticking around. Go ahead and pull up your assignment from over the weekend so that you can compare your answers to some of the exemplars that I'm going to go over. First one I want to look at is Nevaeh's. No, Tamar. Sorry, Tamar. Tamar gave what I might have been the best answer for number one. She only used one piece of evidence, which actually is fine. But this was an author's craft question. How does London show the reader the depths of Buck's love for Thornton? So author's craft questions are hard because you have to get into the heads of the characters and then also the head of the writer who invented those characters and the things that they do. Tamar does a good job in her assertion. She knows this is an author's craft question, so she throws a by in there. Whenever you're asked how an author does something, you gotta throw a by, right? Take a look at what I'm talking about. She says London shows the depth of Buck's love for Thornton by describing Buck's actions and reactions towards anything Thornton does. Now she gets into her context. Buck is really protective over Thornton and gets worried about Thornton with anything he does. Right? She's starting to get more specific. Now I know that this quote, because of that context, I know this quote's going to be showing me that. In the text, London wrote, quote, Buck on the bank, worried and anxious, kept abreast of the boat, his eyes never off his master. This highlights that Buck is always attentive when it comes to Thornton. Notice she's using the language that she used in her assertion to help prove her point. This highlights that Buck is always attentive when it comes to Thornton because he has so much love that is big and meaningful for Buck and Thornton. Again, she's getting into the depths. She's always remembering, what am I proving here? In conclusion, Buck has so much love for Thornton because he learned to love someone that saved his life while still having his own struggles. Buck's love goes so deep for John that he has a fear of losing him or John abandoning him. So, Tamar, just a really solid example of you going through those steps of here's what I'm proving, here's some context to catch you up to speed of what I'm about to show you. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about right here in my evidence. And now in my analysis and conclusion, I'm going to kind of zoom back out and talk to you about how what I just showed you proves what I'm saying. So really solid writing, Tamar. Very impressed. For numbers, for number two, I wanted to compare because I told you some people are going to say the question was about who's benefiting more from their relationship, Buck or Thornton. And so Catherine's going to argue Thornton and Molly's going to argue Buck. What I wanted to point out with Catherine's answer before we even read what she wrote, look at how thorough she was in filling out the T-chart. She put a lot of thought into this. You can tell that she was kind of torn between Buck and Thornton, but obviously you can tell from the highlights that she ends up going with Thornton. And her strongest piece of evidence is that Buck is willing to do work or do anything for him. She says Thornton has benefited more from the relationship because Buck has been saved twice. Okay, sorry. Thornton has benefited more from the relationship with Buck because he has been saved twice, and Buck sacrifices everything for him. While Buck is around, Thornton knows he will survive any situation, and Buck will do anything for him. Quote, the next instant he was grappling with Buck on the extreme edge. Catherine, I think in this case you could have just kind of summarized what happened with some embedded evidence, because that quote just kind of threw us straight into something that, if you hadn't read it, would be confusing. Buck would be willing to jump off of a cliff for Thornton. Quote, Buck and Thornton were jerked under the water, and he would risk his life for him. Buck doesn't mind doing hard work for Thornton because of his love towards him. Buck now has a natural instinct to do anything he is commanded to do by Thornton. Quote, and drove in for the throat again. Buck is even wanting to kill someone for Thornton and for his safety. So I know this one was a three-pointer, but Catherine, the focus is just to embed evidence. So I think you could have explained a lot of that in your own words and just thrown in some keywords here and there. But yeah, those are. I knew some of you were going to pick Thornton as benefiting more because in the pages we read over the weekend, we saw Buck show that he's willing to jump off a cliff for him. Buck carrying stuff around for him. Buck sticking up for him in a bar fight, almost killing someone who punched him. And the most extreme example was Buck saved him from drowning by jumping into a raging river. Molly, on the other hand, is going to argue that Buck has benefited more. She says, I believe Buck has benefited more from this relationship with Thornton because of the more compassionate things Thornton did for Buck, like saving him and taking him in. Buck was abused and had a meaningless life, but after Thornton showed up, he has a life that's worth living and a master that's worth protecting. But all Thornton really got was like a friend and a guard dog, I guess. I think the fact that Buck thinks Thornton is the ideal master makes me think that he really cares for Thornton and adores Thornton for the way his life turned around positively with Thornton in it. And the fact that Buck saves him all the time is just amazing and so compassionate. So right here, Molly is acknowledging that Thornton benefits too. So this is a good writing technique. When you're proving one point, it's okay to acknowledge the other side, but then you can kind of overpower it. And the fact that Buck saves him, while Thornton just used Buck to elevate the conversation when he said, Buck can start 1,000 pounds. You're getting ahead, Molly. It means that Buck is strong and that it seems like he just used Buck to make everyone seem so impressed by Thornton. I'm not calling Thornton a bad person, but I'm kind of offended when reading it. Yeah, like when he sees if his dog will jump off a cliff for him, like that's weird to even test that out. All I'm saying is that the relationship was a benefit for Buck more because he got a master and a meaning to life when Thornton just got a guard dog and a friend. Thus, I think that Buck got the upper hand of the relationship. Interesting. Interesting. Well, let's get into today's reading. Let's kind of preview it before we start it together. Molly read ahead and she mentioned something about a bet that Thornton makes. We're going to read about that bet today. So we're going to get into number one. Just number one, it says, what is Thornton's bluff and how is it called? These are poker terms. So I'm sure you've heard the term that someone's bluffing, right? When you're bluffing, it means you are indicating that you can do something or you have something that you might not actually have. In poker, remember when you're playing poker, if you don't put money down for that hand, then you have to fold your cards. So if we're playing and I've got my cards and I put down a whole big old stack of chips, you would assume I'm doing that because I'm holding really good cards. And so I want more money. I want this hand to be worth more money because my cards are so good. But sometimes in poker, you do that even if you don't have good cards because you want other people to think that you do. That's called a bluff. Now, when someone bluffs, some people might believe it and they fold, they put their cards down and they back out of that hand, you can also call their bluff. If you ever had someone said that someone was called out, that means the person doesn't think they have what they have, so they put the same amount of chips down, or maybe even more, because they want to see, all right, show your cards, let's see if you actually got it, right? So a bluff is when you're kind of faking like you have something that you might not actually. When a bluff is called, it means someone saying, all right, let's see, right? And the way that you say let's see is they put down more money or the same amount of money and say, now prove it, okay? All right. So like a real life example, someone saying like, oh, I guarantee I can hit a half court shot. And someone said, oh, you guarantee it? Okay, here's $20. I bet you $20 you can't, right? That's an example of a bluff and the bluff being called. Because then the person would have to take the half court shot, and if they miss, they have to pay $20. But if they win, they get $20. So sometimes it works out. Sometimes you're not bluffing. Anyways, no more poker talk. Let's get into number one. We're looking for what is Thornton's bluff and how was it called? Right here at that winter. That winter at Dawson, Buck performed another exploit. Not so it's comparing it to Buck had just saved Thornton from drowning. Buck performed another exploit. Not so heroic, but one that put his name many notches higher on the totem pole of Alaskan fame. This exploit was particularly gratifying to the three men, for they stood in need of the outfit which it furnished, and were enabled to make a long-desired trip to the Virgin East, where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the El Dorado saloon, in which men waxed boastful of their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his record, was the target of these men, and Thornton was driven to stoutly to defend him. So far, it's just talking about how it's kind of previewing that Buck is gonna did something amazing, and that based on whatever exploit he did, it's gonna enable Thornton's group to take a trip to a long desired trip into the Virgin East, where miners had not yet appeared. So whatever Buck's gonna do in this section, it's going to enable them to take a trip into some unmined territories. We don't know what it is yet. Now we join them in the saloon, which is an old West way of saying a bar, where men like to brag about their dogs. And because Buck is kind of famous, people are kind of making comments about him because he's got a high profile. He's got a lot of clout. At the end, right here, guys. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. Pooh, said John Thornton. Buck can start 1,000 pounds. And break it out and walk off with it 100 yards? Demanded Matheson, a bonanza king, he of the 700 vaunt. I'm not sure what that means, guys. A bonanza king, though, means that, remember, the gold rush is also called the bonanza. If Matheson is a bonanza king, it means this is one of the rich guys who actually did hit it big. He's got some gold. And break it out and walk off with it 100 yards. John Thornton said coolly. Well, Matheson said, slowly and deliberately, so that all could hear. I've got $1,000 that says he can't. And there it is. So saying, he slammed a sack of gold dust the size of a bologna sausage down upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if bluff it was, had been called. He could feel... Okay, so right there, guys, you can answer number one. What is Thornton's bluff, and how is it called? Take a second to pause me and answer it there. All right. As we continue on, number 3 is one of those that you're going to build as you go. So we are going to look for the answer for number 2, but there's things that we can answer for number 3 as we go. So we know what Thornton's bluff is. He said, "My Buck can pull 1,000 pounds." Matheson calls him out, says, "I bet you $1,000 you can't." This whole scene is going to build up to Buck's attempt at pulling 1,000 pounds, and the suspense is going to build and build and build until it gets to the point where, like, by the time Buck tries it, there's a lot of suspense or tension. What you need to be paying close attention to, because I want you to pay close attention to how good authors build tension and build suspense. Whenever you see something start to build the suspense, build the tension, make things riskier, right? You're going to write down what that detail is, and then you're going to say what the effect is. Okay. And I'm gonna model that as we go, but just be on the lookout for little details that make this bet even more high stakes and suspenseful. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if bluff it was, had been called. He could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up to his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds, half a ton. The enormousness of it appalled him. He had great faith in Buck's strength, and had often thought himself capable of starting such a load, but never, as now, had he faced the possibility of it. The eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. Further, he had no $1,000, nor had Hans or Pete. All right, there's a couple different examples we can use just from this paragraph. All right, how is London building the suspense of this bet? Okay, I think some of these descriptions right here. The flush of warm blood creeping up to his face, his tongue, or just right here. What does this show? What does this detail show? How does it add suspense? You can copy and paste the quote if you need to. Because that's not the start of it, and the page number was 66. How does this detail on the left, how does that, what effect does that have, right? How does it build suspense for the scene? If the blood is creeping up to his face, this shows me that this description shows that Thornton may be in over his head. He's not positive Buck can actually pull 1,000 pounds. His face is turning red because he knows he may be in trouble. All right? That's an example of how you kind of get into his head to explain the effect and how this is building to the tension. That is also my feedback for the day. That's going to help you really do a good job on this. You got to think like Thornton for the effect side on number 3. For most of these pages, we've been in Buck's shoes. We've been thinking from Buck's perspective. In this section, think from Thornton's perspective. Put yourself in his shoes. And what are these little details that are adding the suspense? Okay. There's a number of them just in this paragraph, right? The fact that right here, the eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. How does that add suspense? How does that build the drama? Find 3 details. You can't use the one I just wrote out. If you want to use the eyes of a dozen men were fixed upon him, silent, waiting. You're good to use that one. You need to explain it though. But as we get up to the in this section, just keep your eye out for little details like this, whether it's things people are saying or just people watching, like things that London wrote into the scene that make you more nervous as we lead to this scene. Okay, let's read a little bit more together. Number 2 says, how is the term breakout debated, and how will the verdict impact Trump? What? How will the verdict impact Buck? Why am I thinking about Donald Trump right now? Maybe because he bluffs all the time. All right. I've got a sled standing outside now with 20 50-pound sacks of flour on it. Matheson went on with brutal directness. So don't let that hinder you. Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face in the absent way of a man who has lost the power of thought and is seeking somewhere to find the thing that will start it going again. The face of Jim O'Brien, a Macedon king, an old-time comrade, caught his eyes. That means they're old friends. It was as a cue to him, seeming to rouse him to do what he would have never dreamed of doing. Can you lend me 1,000? He asked, almost in a whisper. Sure, answered O'Brien, thumping down a plethoric sack by the side of Matheson. Though it's little faith I'm having, John, that the beats can do the trick. So John just borrowed $1,000 because he doesn't have it from a friend to do this bet. What's going to happen if he can't pay it? The Eldorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. The tables were deserted, and the dealers and the gamekeepers came forth to see the outcome of the wager and to lay odds. Several hundred men, furred and mittened, banked around the sled within easy distance. Matheson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours, and in the intense cold, it was 60 below zero, the runners had frozen fast to the hard-packed snow. Men offered odds of 2-1 that Buck could not budge the sled. 2-1 odds means that that for every dollar you put down, you'll get 2 back if you take the underdog side. So Buck is the underdog. So if the odds are 2-1 that Buck could not budge the sled, then if I bet $50 that he can, I'll win 100 if he actually does it. If I bet $50 that he can, he doesn't, I'll just lose my $50. A quibble arose concerning the phrase break out. O'Brien contended it was Thornton's privilege to knock the runners loose, leaving Buck to break it out from a dead standstill. Matheson insisted that the phrase included breaking the runners from the frozen grip of the snow. A majority of the men who had witnessed the making of the bet decided in his favor, whereat the odds went up 3-1 against Buck. There were no takers. Not a man believed him capable of the feat. So real quick, guys. Number 2, how was the term breakout debated? And how will the verdict impact Buck? Right? So what are they arguing about when it comes to the term breakout? And then the verdict, what do they decide it means? And how will that impact Buck? All right. We've read enough now that you can answer that question. Continue reading on, find more examples of things that are adding to the tension, copy and paste them in the detailed evidence and the effect. Put yourself in Thornton's shoes. How does that detail, how is it making you more and more nervous, scared? How's it excited even? All right. All of those are building the suspense. Can't wait to see your guys' thinking on this as you put together this tracker, and tomorrow we'll find out how Buck does. I will see you guys tomorrow. Do your best on this and have a great rest of your day.